A winter fog clings to the cobblestones of London. Behind the grim towers of the fortress that would become legend, the Tower of London, two boys vanish into the shadows. They are princes, heirs to a kingdom, and in the silence of their disappearance, a single name echoes: Richard. Richard III, the king remembered less as a ruler than as a monster, the hunchbacked usurper, the tyrant who murdered his own blood. The last medieval king. For centuries, his story has been told not in chronicles, but in whispers, in Shakespeare's venomous verse. A man deformed in body and soul, who clawed his way to the crown over the corpses of innocence. A man whose reign lasted barely 2 years, ending in betrayal, blood, and a horse begged for in vain on a muddy battlefield. And yet, was he truly the villain? Or merely the victim of history's cruelest propaganda? Richard was born into a world where brothers turned against brothers, where roses, white and red, dripped with blood in the wars of the roses. He rose as a loyal knight, a brother to kings. But when death left 2 boys as heirs to the throne, Richard seized the crown for himself. It was an act that sealed his legacy in infamy. The tower swallowed the princes. Rumors turned to certainty. Richard became the murderer king. And though he sat upon the throne of England, he was already haunted by the specter of his alleged crime. 2 years later, on the field of Bosworth, destiny came for him. Betrayed by his allies, surrounded by Tudor's men, Richard fought like a lion cornered. His crown was ripped from his head, his body hacked to pieces. His corpse dragged, displayed, humiliated, then buried beneath stone and forgotten. Until 2012, when beneath a parking lot in Leicester, his skeleton was found, twisted with scoliosis, marked with savage wounds. At last, the villain of Shakespeare stood face to face with the science of archaeology. Richard III, was he a tyrant, or a tragedy? A king, or a criminal? The last warrior king of England, or the first victim of Tudor spin? Tonight, we open the dark book of Richard's life. From the shadows of the tower to the mud of Bosworth, from coronation to curse, this is the story of a man crushed between power and shame. Richard Plantagenet was not born into peace. He came screaming into the world on October 2, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle, a child of the House of York, already marked by destiny, already claimed by blood. His father was Richard, Duke of York, a man who dared to challenge the throne itself, and his mother Cecily Neville, the proud Rose of Raby. From the very beginning, Richard was not merely a boy, but a piece on the most dangerous chessboard in England, the Wars of the Roses. The England of Richard's childhood was a cauldron of betrayal and civil war. Red and white roses meant more than flowers, they meant death sentences. One season, the Yorkists triumphed, their banners snapping proudly in the wind. The next, the Lancastrians returned with vengeance, and heads rolled on Tower Hill. For a child, this was not a bedtime story, it was survival training. Richard was small, pale, and often sickly. Later chronicles, and Shakespeare above all, would sneer at his twisted back, painting him as a hunchbacked fiend. Modern science would call it scoliosis. But in the 15th century, a crooked body was seen as the mark of a crooked soul. Imagine the boy, staring into polished steel, his reflection mocking him with bent shoulders and uneven hips. Did he learn then that in order to be respected, he must be feared? By the age of 8, Richard had tasted exile. After the Lancastrians briefly crushed the Yorkists, he and his elder brother George were whisked away to the Netherlands, seeking shelter in the court of Burgundy. For most boys, childhood meant games of dice, laughter, stories by the fire. For Richard, it meant cold foreign halls, whispers of defeat, and the knowledge that his father had died on the battlefield, his head displayed on the gates of York with a paper crown mockingly placed upon it. This was the crucible in which Richard's character was forged. Loss, humiliation, exile, they were not scars he would outgrow. They were the marrow of his bones. When the tide turned again, and Edward, Richard's elder brother, seized victory and claimed the throne as Edward IV, Richard was only a teenager. Yet already, he bore himself with the hardened edge of a soldier. While other young nobles danced at court, Richard trained with sword and lance, riding into skirmishes, his thin frame clad in steel. Chroniclers wrote of his ferocity in battle, small of stature, great of spirit. It was said he fought not like a prince, but like a man with something to prove. And prove himself he did. At 17, Richard distinguished himself at the Battle of Barnet, 1471, where the Yorkists smashed the forces of the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. On the muddy fields of Tewkesbury, he cut down Lancastrian resistance, fighting side by side with his brother Edward. For Richard, this was no mere war of roses. It was personal revenge for the humiliation of exile, the murder of his father, the scorn he had endured since boyhood. In Edward IV's glittering court, Richard was a paradox. On one hand, he was fiercely loyal to his brother, serving him with almost obsessive devotion. Edward rewarded him with titles, lands, and the rich Duchy of Gloucester. On the other, Richard remained a shadowed figure, reserved, brooding, mistrusted by some courtiers who whispered of his crooked spine and colder heart. While Edward feasted, hunted, and dallied with mistresses, Richard cultivated an image of stern discipline and piety. It was said he rose at dawn to hear Mass, that he refused the frivolities of the court. To some, he was a saint of austerity. To others, a silent wolf waiting for his moment. But beneath this mask, Richard was human. He married Anne Neville, daughter of the mighty Earl of Warwick, the same Kingmaker he had once fought against. Their marriage was born of politics, but in it flickered a rare tenderness. Anne, herself a widow of the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, carried her own scars of war. Together, they were bound less by passion than by shared tragedy. Yet even here, shadows intruded. Their only son, Edward of Middleham, was sickly, and his frailty mirrored Richard's own haunted childhood. All of Richard's youth, exile, loss, whispered mockery, loyalty to his brother, was a prelude to the storm that would follow. For though he had proven himself a soldier, a commander, a loyal duke, fate had marked him for something darker. He had grown up in a world where crowns were won by blood and lost by betrayal, where family ties were as fragile as the roses they carried on their banners. And when Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, leaving two young sons as heirs, Richard faced the same crucible that had defined his childhood. He was no longer the boy mocked for his bent back, no longer the exile running from death. He was the man poised on the edge of a throne, where the lessons of his childhood would determine whether he became savior or usurper. In Richard, the child of war became the king of shadows. April, 1483. The Kingdom of England wakes to shock. King Edward IV, tall, golden, larger than life, lies cold in his bed, dead at just 40. The man who had won a crown through fire and steel, who had crushed the Lancastrians and brought uneasy peace, is gone. He leaves behind a boy, Edward V, only 12 years old, and a fractured kingdom. Factions stir like wolves scenting blood. The Woodvilles, Edward's in-laws, move quickly to secure power, eager to crown the child and rule through him. But in the shadows, a different figure rises, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's younger brother. Richard had always been loyal, always the quiet blade in Edward's hand. But now, with his brother gone, Richard stood between two futures, one where the boy Edward V sat safely on the throne, or one where Richard himself would seize the crown. The drama begins on the road to London. Richard intercepts his young nephew, Edward V, and his entourage. With calm words and iron courtesy, Richard assumes guardianship of the boy. For his safety, he says. Yet beneath the velvet is steel. Edward is escorted to the Tower of London, supposedly the traditional place to await coronation. But the gates close with a sound that echoes like a prison door. Soon after, Edward's younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, joins him in the Tower. Two boys, two heirs, two obstacles. At first, London murmurs with anticipation of the coronation. But then, whispers spread like poison. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, Richard's sister-in-law, was declared invalid by a conveniently unearthed precontract, making all their children illegitimate. The princes, once heirs, were stripped of their claim. And suddenly, the path cleared for Richard. On June 26, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became Richard III, King of England. The coronation was magnificent. Banners fluttered, choirs sang, nobles bowed. Richard wore the crown with solemn dignity, his wife Anne at his side. Yet behind the gold and ceremony lurked the question that would define his reign. What of the boys in the tower? The princes were seen less and less. Some claimed they glimpsed them playing in the gardens. Others swore they heard their laughter from high windows. And then, silence. By late summer, no one saw them again. London buzzed with rumors. Had they been smothered in their sleep? Poisoned? Drowned in a wine butt? Some whispered that Richard himself crept into the tower at night, a dagger hidden in his cloak. Whether true or not, the story became legend. Richard, the uncle who murdered his nephews to steal the crown. In truth, no record confirms their fate. Some argue Richard spared them, that others, perhaps Henry Tudor's agents, had motive to remove them. But history does not care for uncertainty. It prefers villains. And Richard's bent back, his grim face, his sudden rise from loyal duke to crowned king. He fit the part too perfectly. Yet for a brief moment, Richard III shone. He was not merely a shadowed usurper, he was a king who worked tirelessly. He reformed the courts, ensuring even the poor could seek justice. He cracked down on corruption, sought to stabilize trade, and brought discipline to a realm weary of chaos. But all this was drowned in the tide of suspicion. The disappearance of the princes clung to him like a curse. His reign was only 2 years long, but it felt like 2 decades of mistrust. Wherever he walked, whispers followed: murderer, child killer, tyrant. The dramatic irony is cruel. Richard's reign was born in grandeur, but the shadow of the Tower of London hung over it like a spectre. Every victory, every reform, every moment of dignity was poisoned by one unanswered question: where are the princes? Thus Richard's rise was not one of glory, but of infamy. He had gained the crown, but lost the people. He was king, yet already haunted. He sat upon the throne of England not as a savior, but as a figure cursed, half ruler, half phantom, awaiting the storm that would consume him. From the moment Richard III placed the crown upon his head, shadows clung to him like a second skin. He was king, yes, but a king without innocence, a ruler whispered to have murdered children. And in England, the whispers mattered more than proclamations. The streets of London, once jubilant for coronations, began to hum with unease. People swore that at night, in the alleyways near the tower, they could hear the faint cries of boys, their voices carried on the wind. Mothers clutched their children tighter, as if Richard's guilt might seep from palace walls and poison their own households. Whether the princes were alive or not ceased to matter. The rumor had become truth, and truth had become curse. Richard's court grew colder. Nobles who had once feasted under his brother Edward now eyed him with suspicion. The Woodvilles seethed, their bloodlines stripped of legitimacy. Old allies turned distant, fearful of his wrath, or plotting his downfall. Even his beloved Anne Neville, once his partner in shadow, waned in health. Her slow decline became the stuff of gossip. Some whispered Richard poisoned her to pursue a new marriage with his niece, Elizabeth of York. Whether true or not, the scandal was irresistible. In the eyes of his people, Richard was not only a usurper, but a husband willing to sacrifice his own wife for ambition. But perhaps the cruelest blow came from fate itself. In 1484, his only son, Edward of Middleham, died suddenly at the age of 10. With him, the last hope of Richard's line vanished into the grave. Chroniclers say the king locked himself in his chamber for days, emerging pale, hollow-eyed, a man already half dead. To his enemies, it was divine justice. To his allies, it was a sign that the House of York was cursed. As the king's inner world crumbled, storms gathered outside England's shores. Across the channel, a new figure sharpened his blade: Henry Tudor. He was not, by blood, the strongest claimant. But he was Lancastrian enough, and most importantly, he was not Richard. Exiles, disaffected nobles, and foreign backers began to rally around him. France, eager to see England weakened, offered ships and soldiers. Henry promised to marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring roses in one crown. To many weary of civil war, he was hope wrapped in prophecy. Richard saw the danger, but paranoia clouded his sight. He tightened his grip, demanding loyalty oaths, seizing lands from doubters, executing those who wavered. Yet the more he grasped, the more loyalty slipped through his fingers. It was said that in the royal halls, silence fell when he entered, as though courtiers feared that even their breath might betray them. And then came the omens. Chroniclers recorded storms lashing the coast, comets streaking across the night sky. Some swore that the ghosts of the princes walked the battlements of the tower, their pale faces pressing against the stone, watching. Even Shakespeare, writing a century later, would imagine Richard tormented in his sleep by a parade of spirits, the boys, his brother Clarence, his allies, all whispering curses into his ear. By 1485, the stage was set. Henry Tudor landed on the western coast of England with a modest army, but his march gathered strength with every mile. Nobles long disillusioned with Richard defected in secret. The king scrambled to raise his forces, yet he knew the truth. He would ride into battle with men he could not trust. Still, Richard was not a coward. On the eve of Bosworth, he addressed his troops with fire in his voice, swearing that he would live or die as king. Yet even then, rumors spread through campfires that Stanley, one of his key commanders, had already pledged in secret to Henry. Betrayal was not a possibility, it was inevitable. Richard stood at the edge of his fate, a man surrounded by enemies, haunted by ghosts, abandoned by fortune. The crown he had seized with ruthless precision now weighed heavier than iron. He had become what he most feared, a king alone. And the battlefield at Bosworth awaited him. Dawn broke over the fields of Bosworth on August 22, 1485. Mist clung low to the marshland, curling around the tents and standards of two armies destined to decide England's future. To the east, Richard III's banners, emblazoned with the white boar, flapped defiantly in the cold wind. To the west, Henry Tudor's red dragons stirred, carried by men who believed themselves the agents of prophecy. The ground itself seemed to tremble, as if aware that this was no ordinary battle, but the final act of the medieval age. Richard rode among his troops, clad in armor polished like a mirror, the crown itself affixed to his helmet. He was no shadow now, no whisper of a hunchbacked villain. He was a king of war, his lance in hand, his voice sharp as steel. This day we fight not only for our lives, but for England. His men roared, but even in their cries lingered doubt. Too many eyes flickered to the horizon where Lord Stanley's troops waited, silent, undecided. Would they strike for Richard, or betray him to Henry? The battle began in chaos. Arrows darkened the sky, cannon thundered, men clashed in a frenzy of steel and blood. Richard's forces, larger in number, should have crushed Henry's fragile host. Yet hesitation poisoned them, units faltered, nobles wavered, and betrayal seeped into the ranks like a slow-acting poison. Amidst the roar, Richard's gaze fixed on one figure, Henry. Tudor himself, kept far to the rear, guarded by his French mercenaries. For Richard, the choice was clear. End the pretender, end the rebellion, and England would be his. With a sudden, savage cry, Richard spurred his horse forward. Like a thunderbolt, he cut through the field, his knights thundering at his back. Chroniclers would later gasp at his charge, calling it the most desperate act of courage ever seen on English soil. Richard enhorsed knights, cut down standard-bearers, and drove his lance within a sword's length of Henry himself. For a heartbeat, history trembled. Had Richard struck true, the Tudor dream would have ended in the mud. But fate, and betrayal, intervened. The Stanley forces, who had lingered like vultures on the hills, suddenly swooped down, against Richard. His men scattered, his companions were cut down, and the king found himself encircled. Still, he did not yield. Chroniclers swore that Richard fought with the fury of 10 men, his sword flashing, his armor drenched in blood, not only of his enemies but of his own wounds. He hacked his way toward Henry, screaming his defiance. It was then that the words were said, the immortal cry, later immortalized by Shakespeare, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" Some say he truly shouted it, desperate as his steed collapsed beneath him in the mire. Others claim it was legend, propaganda, theater. But whether he spoke it or not, the image endures, the last Plantagenet king, thrashing in the mud, clawing for survival, offering a kingdom for the chance to fight again. Surrounded, Richard was struck down at last. A poleaxe shattered his helmet, a sword slashed his jaw, blades pierced his body again and again. Yet even in death, he fought. The chronicler Polydore Virgil wrote, King Richard, alone, was killed fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies. When the dust settled, the crown was found, literally plucked from a thorn bush, as if fate itself mocked him. It was placed upon Henry Tudor's head on the battlefield. England had a new king, Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. And Richard? His body was stripped, his armor torn away, his corpse slung naked across a horse's back. Through the streets of Leicester it was paraded, bruised and bloodied, his twisted spine exposed for all to see. Where once he had been king, now he was spectacle, a carcass for the jeering mob. At last, he was buried hastily in the Greyfriars Church, with neither ceremony nor dignity. Earth closed over him, and England turned the page. Richard was gone, his reign a flicker, his name a curse. For centuries, his grave was lost, erased by time. Some swore the earth itself had swallowed him. Others whispered his ghost walked Bosworth Field, still searching for his lost crown. He became not a man, but a myth, the tyrant king, damned for eternity. It would take more than 500 years before his bones, twisted and broken, would be unearthed beneath a Leicester car park. Proof that history never buries its dead for long. Richard III's death at Bosworth was not merely the end of a king, it was the end of an era. He was the last of the Plantagenets, the last king to die on English soil in battle, the last echo of a medieval world swept away by the Tudors. But death did not silence him, it transformed him. The Tudors, eager to legitimize their fragile rule, painted Richard as a monster. Chroniclers under Henry VII's patronage described him as a twisted figure, cruel in spirit as he was in body. And then came Shakespeare. With his humped back, clawed arm, and serpentine smile, the Richard of the stage became immortal, the very embodiment of tyranny and treachery. For centuries, schoolchildren knew not the man, but the caricature. Yet history is never so simple. In truth, Richard was also a capable ruler. He reformed the justice system, expanded rights for commoners, and strove to govern fairly in his short reign. He was not merely the villain his enemies claimed. Perhaps he was ambitious, perhaps ruthless, but he was also a man crushed between dynasties, betrayed by allies, and devoured by propaganda. And then, in 2012, beneath the asphalt of a Leicester car park, his story shifted once more. Archaeologists unearthed his remains, twisted by scoliosis, scarred by mortal wounds. Science stripped away centuries of myth. Richard was no Shakespearean demon. He was a human being, flawed, complex, fragile. The discovery reignited debate. Was he truly the murderer of the princes in the tower, or the scapegoat of Tudor lies? Was he a tyrant, or a tragic king destroyed by history's cruel pen? What is certain is this: Richard III still fascinates. His rise and fall remain one of England's most dramatic tales, a reminder that power is fleeting, truth is malleable, and history is written not by the dead, but by the victors. Richard may have lost his kingdom for a horse, but in death, he gained something greater: immortality.